For more than 30 years, hunting was my life. There was no trail I couldn't follow, no animal that could escape the sights of my rifle. I was one of those who hunted out of sheer habit. I'll be honest with you, without respecting the rhythms of the earth or asking Pachamama for permission. But the mountains collect their debts, son. Sooner or later, they collect them. And they sent me a punishment that drove me from the hills forever. It was an autumn afternoon, nearing dusk. I had ventured deep into a steep ravine, a place where the trees are so tall and dense that the sunlight fades a couple of hours earlier. I was tracking some wild cubs with my 2 sheepdogs, who were as fierce as they come. Suddenly, the atmosphere grew heavy. The song of the charadas cut off. The magpies fell silent, and the only sound left was the crunch of my own boots on the damp leaf litter. The dogs, who had been running ahead, came to a sudden halt. They began to whimper, a low, plaintive whine, with their backs bristling and their tails tucked between their legs. I'd never seen them like that before. Suddenly, a dreadful stench filled the ravine. It wasn't the smell of an ordinary dead animal. It was a mixture of rancid dung, sour sweat, and rotting flesh, so strong it made me gag. I wanted to turn back, but before I could take a step, a dark mass leaped out from among the giant ferns. My dogs, acting purely on a defensive instinct, charged toward the smoke. They didn't last even 10 seconds. That thing grabbed the first one by the neck with one hand and smashed it against a rock in the ravine. It snapped the other one in half, as if it were a dry branch. The screams of my animals pierced my heart. I froze, the rifle trembling in my hands. The creature turned around and stood up straight. It was nearly 2 meters tall, as broad as a wardrobe, entirely covered in matted black fur, caked with mud and thistles. It had a narrow, flattened forehead and a long, filthy beard that reached down to its chest. But the worst part, the thing that still makes me wake up screaming at night, was its eyes. They were 2 embers of fire, bloodshot red eyes that glowed with a perverse, human intelligence in the twilight of the woods. It stared at me and let out a snort that splattered my face with warm, foul-smelling saliva. Then it let out a scream that stunned me. It wasn't a puma's roar or a fox's yelp. It sounded like the voice of a desperate man, a deep wail that echoed off the stone walls. I screamed in sheer terror, dropped my gun to the ground because my hands wouldn't obey me, and took off running like a damned madman uphill, tripping over roots, tearing my clothes on thorns. I could feel its heavy footsteps behind me, the brush snapping behind my back, but I didn't look back. I crawled back to my ranch, barely able to breathe. I spent 3 days with a raging fever, vomiting bile, and with my blood pressure through the roof. My wife soothed my fear with holy water because I couldn't stop shaking. The police investigators never found anything, just the mangled bodies of my dogs. I know the skeptics in town say I was attacked by a big honey bear, but I know the woods. What I came face to face with that afternoon was the Ucumar. I understood the message. The land had set a limit for me. Since that night, I hung up my hunting gear and never again touched a gun or set foot in the woods after 6 in the evening. This story I'm about to tell you, son, nobody told it to me. I've got it branded right here in my chest from the sheer terror I had to go through back in the winter of 2021. I own a small piece of land, just a few miles outside of Metán, right against the slope of the mountain where the woods start getting thick and treacherous. Back then, I lived all by myself. My only company was an old mare, a few goats, and some chickens that were my sole livelihood. Things have been turning strange for 3 nights straight. The animals refused to eat. The mare spent the early hours of the morning neighing, staring fixedly at the wire fence bordering the woods, and the neighbor's dogs would howl with that long, sorrowful wail that foreshadows death. On one of those nights, a freezing drizzle broke out, the kind that cuts right to your bones. It must have been about 10:30 in the evening when I heard the commotion. It was an awful crash. The wooden boards of the chicken coop groaned, and the hens started squawking like crazy, a racket of pure terror. Thinking it was a weasel or some sly fox coming down from the mountain, I grabbed my big 3-cell flashlight, threw my poncho over my shoulders, and stepped out into the yard, splashing through the mud. As I got closer to the goat pen, the smell stopped me dead in my tracks. It was an unbearable stench, heavy like a rotting beast mixed with stale urine. The animals were huddled in a corner, trembling, paralyzed with fear. I aimed the flashlight toward the chicken coop, and my heart skipped a beat. The woven wire door had been ripped clean off, bent as if it were a piece of paper. And inside, crouching among the feathers and the mud, there was a massive shape. When a flashlight's beam hit it, that thing turned around slowly. It began to straighten up, and its head brushed against the thatched roof of the coop. It was a hulking beast, about 6 feet tall, wide as a wardrobe, and covered from head to toe in thick, dark brown, almost black, fur dripping with water and caked with manure. It had gigantic hands with thick fingers ending in uneven black claws, and in one of them it held one of my chickens dead, squeezed tightly as if it were a toy. It locked its eyes on me. It had a flat face like a man's but warped, wild, with a filthy beard full of leftover food scraps. But what turned my blood to ice were its eyes. In the middle of the darkness, lit by my flashlight, those eyes glowed a fiery red, a fierce vermilion red, staring at me with a stillness that didn't belong to any animal. It wasn't startled by the light. On the contrary, it sized me up. It dropped the dead chicken into the mud, took a step toward me, coming out of the coop, and let out a shriek that made my ears ring. It was a horrible cry, like a drunk man screaming in agony in the middle of the night, harsh and hoarse. Out of pure terror, the flashlight slipped from my hand into the mud and went out. I was left in pitch blackness out in the yard, under the rain, crying from fear, unable to move my legs. I heard the heavy footsteps of that wretched thing splashing through the mire, moving away toward the fence. I heard the snapping of branches in the woods as it plunged into the thicket, and the wailing of the mare, who wouldn't stop neighing. I don't know how I managed, but I dragged myself back into the shack. I locked the door with a double padlock, shoved the heavy table against the wood, and crawled into bed, shivering. The next day, I woke up with my blood pressure through the roof, and I spent 3 days vomiting from the sheer shock, running a fever that nothing would bring down. When I gathered the courage to go out and check, I found several thick hairs, stiff as pig bristles, caught on the barbs of the perimeter fence. I showed them to an old countryman from around here, and he told me, "Be grateful you're alive, Laureano. What broke into your pen was the Ucumar, and when it comes down hungry, it spares neither beast nor man." To really know what fear is, son, you've got to spend a night all by yourself in a high mountain outpost. Up there, where the woods meet the bare rock and the clouds wrap around your shack. I used to watch over a rancher's cattle in a summer pasture way up high in the hills, right where Salta and Ucumar meet. Up there, there's no signal, no radio, no nothing. It's just you, your knife, your dog, and the vastness of the mountain. It was a night of dry lightning. One of those storms where the sky feels like it's tearing apart, but not a drop of rain falls. just bolts of lightning striking, lighting up the woods for a split second, as if it were broad daylight. I was inside the mud and thatched shack, drinking some mates by the hearth when my dog, Cacique, a mutt half-hound, half-mastiff, the kind that wouldn't back down from a cougar, started scratching at the door in sheer desperation. His ears were pinned flat against his skull, and he was whining in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. Suddenly, the mud and thatch structure of the roof groaned. Something heavy, immensely heavy, had landed on top of the shack. I thought maybe a thick branch had snapped off in the wind, but a second later I heard the dragging sound. They were bipedal footsteps, heavy, walking right across the roof, bending the wooden rafters underneath. Cacique bolted under my cot, and there was no coaxing him out. He was trembling so hard his teeth were chattering. I grabbed my machete and my flashlight, but before I could even get close to the door, the walker on the roof stopped right above where I was standing. And that's when hell broke loose. From right above the thatch, a sound began to rise. It was a voice, a thick, muddy voice, mimicking the exact call I used to herd the cattle in the morning. Edu, but it sounded warped, hollow, as if a beast were forcing its throat to speak like a Christian man. The blood froze in my veins. I realized that thing was calling out to me from the roof, daring me to come out. A massive flash of lightning struck nearby, and through the cracks in the thatched roof, where the light filtered in, I saw a hand come down. A huge, skeletal, yet powerful hand, covered in long, black hair, with splintered claws clawing at the mud of the roof, trying to dig a hole to get inside. Desperate, I let out a roar of rage to drown out my own fear and drove the tip of my machete with all my might into the ceiling, piercing right through the thatch where the hand was. A hideous shriek echoed out, a sharp scream mixed with a crazed human laugh that shook all 4 adobe walls. The hulking mass leapt off the roof and hit the dirt yard with a thud that sounded like a giant sack of potatoes dropping. I crept over to the small wooden window, cracked it open just a sliver, and aimed the flashlight out into the yard. That's where I saw it, fleeing on 2 legs toward the thickest part of the jungle. It was a wide creature, hairy from head to toe, with a massive hunchback. Before disappearing into the trees, it turned around. The beam of my flashlight hit it dead in the face. It had a flattened forehead, bared fangs, and 2 red eyes glowing like hot coals in the middle of the storm, staring at me with a hatred that won't leave me until the day I die. I spent the rest of the night on my knees in front of the hearth, a machete in one hand and my mother's Bible in the other, praying that wretched thing wouldn't come back. The next day, when the owner came up to bring me supplies, he found me wide-eyed, my blood pressure on the floor, and so shaken up I couldn't even speak. I quit right then and there. The boss climbed onto the roof to check, and he found a trail of thick, black blood along with some stiff hairs that smelled of rot. I didn't care what the townspeople said. I know that night the Ucumar came down for me, and if I hadn't had that machete handy, today I'd be just one more skeleton lost and forgotten in the hills.